Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your host from Radio 2GB and Network 10, current affairs commentator, Mr. Steve Price.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the IPA's budget breakfast. This is my third time here. An unusual situation this morning. We've got some very special guests, one of whom is the Honourable Dr. Andrew Leigh, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, who's running late. So I'm not sure what that says about whether he's still trying to work out what's in the budget or whether he thinks it's such a great document that he's better off not turning up. But we do have in the House the Honourable Michael McCormack MP, who is the Minister for Small Business. Please put your hands together for him. I was here last year and I was here the year before. I'm now 10 kilos lighter. I know a lot of you probably don't watch reality TV, but I was on a little show called I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, and I spent 43 days in the jungle. And I was sitting there on my bed thinking, if someone asked me to compare this to anything else, what would I compare it to? And the best answer I could come up with, I figured it'd be a little bit like being an MP and being forced to come to Canberra, where my jungle camp is Parliament House, where you spend an inordinate amount of time with a bunch of people you don't like, eating bad food, and the only way you can get out is by being voted out. Now, I reckon that's a perfect analogy to what it must be like to be an MP sometimes, without being negative, of course. And most of them want to stay voted in. I should point out a very interesting fact. We've got Andrew Clennell from the Daily Telegraph with us, who's going to help us go through the budget, and Michael Packey from Macquarie Media. Andrew did point out that on this stage in 2015, so don't get nervous, Minister, we had Bruce Bilson, who was then the Small Business Minister. We know what happened to Bruce, sadly. And then last year we had Peter Hendy here, who lost his seat. So let's hope we don't get the trifecta. I'm sure we won't. The rundown this morning is very simple. The Minister will speak on the budget shortly. And if he turns up, Andrew Leigh will give Labor's point of view on what he thinks of last night's budget. We will then take some questions from Andrew and Michael and myself, and then if we've got time, we'll throw it open to all of you on the floor. So don't be shy this morning. If you've got something to whack the government with or praise the government about or to give it to the opposition, please put your hand up. We're happy to have you ask any questions you like. I should mention, of course, our great hosts this morning. This is jointly hosted, this breakfast, by the Institute of Public Accountants, who are the leading body servicing the needs of, can you believe it, 35,000 plus members here and right around Australia and in 80 other countries right around the world. The IPA acquired the Institute of Financial Accountants at the start of last year and formed the IPA Group, which is now the largest small to medium enterprise-focused accounting organisation in the world. I spoke to the boss, Andrew Conway, on my radio program last night. They're very excited about the fact that the small business changes, the tax changes, have been kicked over for another year. We first, of course, talked about those 2 years ago. The IPA is the most credible voice in the country for small business. Also, and I'm very pleased as a honorary Canberran, because I have a daughter studying at ANU here, and I'm in fact here 4 weekends out of the next 5. The Canberra Business Chamber is our other host here this morning, the leading business chamber for the Canberra region. They're the voice of the private sector. They represent the interests of 5,000 business members around Canberra and surrounds. The chamber is a lobby group that calls on all government and political parties to work out their Destination 2030 vision for Canberra and the region. I think what the Canberra Business Chamber should first do, and this is me giving some gratuitous advice, ring up Miranda Devine from the Daily Telegraph, who keeps writing columns about what a fabulous place Canberra is, but she says that all Canberrans are wealthy, that they're out eating smashed avocado on toast, that the place is a roaring success. She's right, it is. It's a great destination and a great place. And yes, public servants might have guaranteed incomes, and yes, it might be better served than perhaps Western Sydney or Northern Melbourne, but so what? It's a great place to live, I tell you what. Any of you who arrived here yesterday under those blue skies and that sunshine, you know exactly what it's like. I should also mention our major event sponsor, the Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand, CANS, professional body with 117,000 members who utilise their talents every day. Members known for their integrity and their judgment, financial discipline and an approach to business that is very prosperous for everybody who works with them. I'll mention our major sponsors as we go through the morning. But I'd like you to put your hands together for the one MP who has turned up to our breakfast this morning, the Honourable Michael McCormack MP, Minister for Small Business and henceforth known as the Minister for the Inland Rail Line. Please put your hands together for the Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, for that kind introduction. And in 1909, the Sydney Rugby League Grand Final was decided. South Sydney were declared premiers after Balmain failed to turn up. But I'm sure Andrew Leigh is a good mate of mine. He'll front, and I might just have to either talk or answer questions. Oh, here he is. Well done, Andrew. You can come up here, mate. Come up here if you like. You want a hand up? It's good as taking it. It's all good. Well, I acknowledge my parliamentary colleague Andrew Leigh, and I know he would have some constituents in the room as well. Are there any constituents from the Riverina here? Hands up. Okay, well, there's one. Okay, so along the lines that you mentioned before, and I don't think the Prime Minister's here, so maybe it won't be the trifecta, Steve, that you perhaps were talking about. So one constituent, hopefully she might vote for me next time. Malcolm isn't here, so anyway, we'll get on with it. I am excited to address you all about last night's budget. Ours is a plan. Scott Morrison's was a plan last night for fairness, for opportunity and indeed for security. And no matter where you live or what postcode you're in or what your terms of existence are, that was certainly the case. Now, Australians know if our economy is strong, then so too there will be more jobs. If our economy grows, then mums and dads have the money in their pockets and small businesses can pursue their dreams, can follow their dreams. And to help grow our economy, we have a plan, a blueprint for success to get Australia back on track and live within our means. Last night's was a budget for all Australians, both in the cities and in the regions. Above all, it was a budget for Australia's future. So I'm excited to share this vision with you. The budget respects future taxpayers. That's so important. And it's projected to return to surplus in the 2021 financial year. We have quarantined the Future Fund, stopped borrowing for recurrent spending, and are making sure that taxpayers' money is invested wisely in infrastructure assets. Budgets are about choices. So we've used this budget, as the Treasurer said, to make the right choices for better days ahead. By making these choices, the coalition government is building the Australia of tomorrow with jobs, families and small business firmly in the driver's seat, today, tomorrow, each and every day. I want to start talking about small business. Every day, more than 5.6 million Australians go to work in Australia's 3.2 million small businesses. And across Australia, our small businesses make up around 99% of all businesses in our country. From sole traders to those great family enterprises, each of them is a story of hard work and dedication. Each of them has taken a risk, just like I did for 8 years before I entered Parliament. And by the sounds of things, I'm taking a bit of a risk by being here today, Steve. But anyway, each of them got there on the sweat of their own endeavours. And just like the budgets of this coalition government in recent years, this one backs small business, our local job creators. That's why we cut the tax rate for small and medium businesses. In 16-17, the rate has been cut to 27.5%, the lowest it's been for many, many decades, affecting many of you in this room today. The tax rate will be phased down to 25% by 26-27. Together with the tax discount for unincorporated small businesses, these changes benefit more than 3 million businesses. And just yesterday I guided this legislation through the House of Representatives, which means our small business plan is now enshrined in law. In guiding that legislation through, I told the Parliament about the hundreds of small business owner and operators I've met in the past few months as part of my national small business roadshow. We appreciate the federal government reducing the company tax rate to 27.5%. We would like to see more of this coming. That will give us cash flow to invest in equipment and machinery to train our staff. Not my words, they're the words of Barry and Lena Salim of Salim Power Engineering Services in Western Sydney. And I toured their business, their small business, with Alex Hawke just a few weeks ago, and I saw firsthand how they take young people, give them an apprenticeship, give them a go. Small business is central in our plan for fairness, for opportunity and for security. In the 44 communities I visited in 24 electorates just in recent weeks, I've also heard how small business operators use the instant asset write-off and replace or upgrade machinery and equipment. It helped immensely, necessary for us to produce good food, for staff morale, and it actually was a chain reaction. That's what Alana Laliotitis describes of the impact Casino Greco's new equipment thanks to our instant asset write-off program. She runs a terrific little Greek restaurant in Parramatta with her husband Peter, which I visited alongside Senator Maurice Payne, the Defence Minister, just recently. Alana told me her instant asset write-off purchases helped her through the busy days. More efficiency, more customers, her words again, not mine. And that's why we're continuing to support small business by extending the instant asset write-off for a further 12 months to help small businesses like Alana, like Barry, like Lena, invest in their business to grow and create local jobs. And our recent changes to the small business tax rate also redefine small business. The Liberal and Nationals in government have real experiences in small business. We know what it's like to take a risk and, importantly, to hire someone whose wage you have to pay regardless of how much the business turns over that month. That's why we know that small business doesn't stop at a $2 million turnover. By redefining small business to a $10 million turnover, thousands more can qualify for the instant asset write-off. And how good is that? It will improve cash flow for small business, helping them to reinvest in their business and replace or upgrade assets, and above all, to have a go. Another thing I've heard loud and clear wherever I go, from Bunbury with Nola Marino in the west to Benalla with Senator Bridget McKenzie, in Bateman's Bay with Ann Sood-Marlis and with Sarah Henderson in Belmont, is that something has to be done, must be done about red tape. Small business know that some paperwork is needed, but would like governments to do more to reduce the burden. I know that, you know that, and I'm sure that everybody here in a small business gets that, understands it. The coalition government has already cut $5.8 billion a year in red tape. It easily eclipses our $1 billion per year target, but we know, as you do, that there's more work to be done, much more work. I understand what it's like to open your doors early in the morning, close them late at night, go home, do the domestic things and then get back into the paperwork. I get that. So I'm pleased to say there's some relief on the way for business activity statements. The simpler BAS will reduce GST compliance by reducing reporting requirements from 7 to 3, GST on sales, GST on purchases, total sales. But the federal government cannot cut red tape alone. Last night we also announced an initiative to encourage state and federal governments to make similar inroads into cutting red tape. The federal government will provide up to $300 million over the 2 years as an incentive to states to reduce unnecessary regulation. And above all, it's about getting out of the way of small business and letting them get on with the job of doing what they do best. Small business is central to the government's plan, and it's backed up with a vision for Australia's future, a blueprint for success. It's a future which our children and our children's children, we've heard the Prime Minister say that many times, can take advantage of the best opportunities to be their best selves, to get a job. A future in which health and education spending is needs-based, it's fair and it's fully funded. Our vision starts by building the infrastructure our country deserves, wants and expects, so we're committing more than $70 billion to projects right across the nation. Last night we committed $5.3 billion to establish the Western Sydney Airport Corporation, another coalition step to deliver this vital project. We will establish a $10 billion national rail program plus $20 million for business cases for faster rail connecting capital cities to major regional centres. As a country MP, I'm also very excited, as Steve mentioned, that we're actually delivering, spending $8.4 million in the Melbourne to Brisbane Inland Rail. Infrastructure creates opportunities, but education, we all know, is the great enabler. Through delivering a needs-based model of funding for schools with investment increasing year on year over the next decade, we're skilling our kids with the tools that they need for the future. It's $18.6 billion over the next decade to make sure that schools' funding is needs-based, equitable and targeted. So too is our investment in health. And we're also reforming the banking system so consumers and taxpayers get a fairer deal. We've announced a 6 basis point levy on big banks' liabilities, which will bring in $6.2 billion, a productivity commission inquiry into competition in the banking sector, and we're establishing a dispute resolution facility for banks to make the system fairer. We will establish a banking executive accountability regime and have tougher penalties for concealing misconduct. And the ACCC will have a dedicated team to investigate banking competition, as well as giving customers greater access to their banking data. These choices take action now to make the system fairer. The revenue we receive will fund our path to balance over the forward estimates. Just finally, these are choices in the budget for fairness. These are choices for opportunity and security. They're choices to back small business, to create jobs and opportunities. They're choices to build the infrastructure that a modern Australia needs, wants, expects and mostly deserves. They are choices to give Australian students and those in our healthcare system, that's all of us, the support they deserve. They're choices to responsibly fund our way back to balance. They're choices for Australia. So thanks to the IPA and the Chamber of Commerce for Canberra for inviting me here today. I look forward to the panel discussion later this morning, and I thank you very much for attending and for listening.
We'll let Michael and Andrew loose on these two shortly with some tough questions, and there is plenty of tough questions. I did note on my radio program last night that the budget was described as Labor light, and some of the commentators, including my friend Andrew Bolt and his colleague Terry McCrann, who's described the budget, by the way, as a dangerous disgrace. Terry never short of an opinion. The fear was, among some of the callers last night, was that this budget, because it has moved much toward Labor's spending model, that it might encourage Labor to become even more likely to spend more of your tax dollars. Let's find out what the Honourable Dr Andrew Leigh, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, has to say about that.
Well, thanks, Steve. And can I acknowledge at the outset we're meeting on traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respect to elders past and present. 13 years ago, in handing down a budget, a former Treasurer urged parents to have one for mum, one for dad and one for the country. What he didn't say at the time is that once you've followed his advice and you've got 3 little boys, it can sometimes take you a little longer than you expect to get out the door and get to the budget breakfast in the Great Hall. So my apologies for cutting it fine this morning. 3 little boys were a little out of sorts this morning. I think it's my 3rd time addressing you, and I'm really pleased to be at this important IPA Canberra Business Chamber event. And I want to approach the budget not through the narrow lens of going announcement by announcement, as we often do on both sides, but by looking at a number of broad themes, starting off with the global context in which we're engaging, and then talking about how this budget affects the Australian challenges of equity, productivity, housing affordability, and getting the budget back to surplus. And I'll say at the end a bit about its impact on Canberra, because I know that'll be a particular concern to many of you in the room. Globally, the IMF has revised upwards its growth forecasts for the first time in a long time. Europe seems to be doing better than we thought it was a couple of years ago. Growth in the United States is solid, and unemployment is particularly promising. When you look at China, you see an economy which is steadily managing the rebalance from export-led growth towards domestic consumption. and which, although you can point to a multiplicity of challenges, as David Chambeau's new book does, you can see a steady increase in the sustainability of the Chinese economic growth model. Chinese growth forecast now sitting around 6.5%, which is where the authorities want it to be. China matters, of course, because it is far more a driver of Australian economic growth than is the economic circumstances of any other nation. Here in Australia, we've seen the iron ore and coal mining boom giving way now to LNG, to LNG as the chief commodity that's driving growth. But as the Reserve Bank's recently noted, LNG supplies relatively few jobs. So while this will show up in the GDP statistics, it's not going to be the driver of employment for many Australians. I want to then think about the impact of this budget on equity. Australia is now in a circumstance in which inequality is at a 75-year high, and wage inequality has been growing for the better part of 40 years. We've seen wages grow over that period 3 times as fast for the top 10th as for the bottom 10th. And yet I worry too much that this budget slugs those on middle incomes while locking in a tax giveaway to those at the top. If you're on $1 million salary, you're about to get a $16,400 tax cut. But if you're on $60,000, then this budget will see you pay a Medicare levy of an extra $325. Delivering last year's budget, Scott Morrison said that this wasn't the time to be increasing taxes on hard-working Australians. Clearly what he meant was that next year, this year's budget, would be the time to increase those taxes. And he's done that with a tax rise that will affect people right across the board, from where the Medicare levy begins cutting in, the $20,000 odd range, right up. But those at the top will see their personal income tax cut easily offset what they'll pay through an increased Medicare levy. That won't be true further down the distribution. Yes, the government is removing some of its Medicare freezes, but they're doing so at a glacial pace. In the case of some of these Medicare freezes, they'll still be in place in 2 years' time. So we worry that for an Australia where inequality is rising, this budget doesn't contain measures that will help to close the gap. In terms of productivity, we've seen productivity still struggle to retain its strong growth levels of the 1990s. Productivity isn't everything, as Paul Krugman's noted, but in the long run, it's almost everything. How do we invest in productivity? Well, we need to make sure that there's sustained investment in infrastructure. This budget does a lot of repackaging of infrastructure programs. But when you look at the biggest on-budget infrastructure program, it's the Collector Road. Now, I'm sure that's a worthy road, and like many of you, I enjoy visiting Collector. But I don't think you would regard that as being a nation-changing infrastructure program. Too much of the infrastructure packages in this budget involve moving things from one fiscal set of accounts to another. They involve feasibility studies and off-budget investments, rather than the sort of concerted infrastructure spend under Labor, which saw us move from 20th in the OECD to 1st in the OECD. And this budget doesn't reverse the 20% fall in public infrastructure investment that we saw in the first 2 years of the coalition government. Productivity too is tied to the national broadband network, which is still going to be a network which comes to a box in your street rather than fibre to the premises. That's not just critical for households, that's critical for businesses. Like the business owner I chatted to in Burnie, who told me that sometimes he'll upload the design files, go down to the local cafe, get a coffee, come back and find that the upload is still taking place. Productivity also has to do with education, and this budget rips $22 billion out of schools, that's the government's own estimates, and takes again from our universities. This is the wrong prescription for an Australia that needs to be a smarter nation, that needs better schools and needs to encourage more kids to attend university. Home ownership, as you know, is at a 60-year low, with the rate having crashed down for young Australians. Almost every expert that you talk to acknowledges that the solution to this must have at its core tackling negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount. Yet even although Scott Morrison and Malcolm Turnbull took changes to these programs to Cabinet last year, the budget fails to take on that central challenge in housing affordability. Until we take on the fact that Australia has, almost uniquely in the developed world, generous tax concessions that are advantaging investors over first home buyers, we won't see an Australia in which young Australians reckon they can put a home over there, buy a home and raise a family. And then there's debt. We were told in 2009, when Malcolm Turnbull launched his debt truck, that it was a near certainty that a coalition government would have lower debt. And yet since then, we've seen debt increase by a factor of 5. The budget papers put a per-person figure on it. When Malcolm Turnbull launched his debt truck, debt per person was a little over $2,000. In this year, debt per person is going to be over $12,000. So a 5-fold increase in debt per person in real terms illustrates clearly that a government that came to office promising a surplus in its first year and every year after that has largely now given up the fight on debt. That's a challenge for an Australia where we know the rating agencies have warned about the loss of the AAA credit rating, and where we know the loss of the AAA credit rating could hurt households and businesses by driving up their borrowing costs. And then there's the impact on Canberra. The ACTs has been overlooked when it comes to the infrastructure spend. The promised Barton Highway upgrades aren't funded this year. Canberra is a place that relies on universities, and yet a $2.7 billion cut to universities will affect the Australian Catholic University, University of Canberra and the ANU, and their ability to act as growth drivers. And the government's doubled down on decentralisation of the public service, such as the disastrous move of the Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority to Barnaby Joyce's electorate. And that means, again, an adverse impact on Canberra. So for Canberra, no special programs, but a lot of programs which could have an adverse impact on our great city. I don't want to finish on suggesting that this budget is uniformly negative, because I think it's important in politics, particularly with my friend Michael McCormack here, to acknowledge a couple of the good measures in the budget. So let me praise the government for allocating funding to ensure that victims of domestic violence are not cross-examined in court by their accused perpetrators. It's a measure which is beyond due, and I'm pleased to see the government do it. And let me too commend the government on following the policy we took to the last election of raising penalties for consumer rip-offs from their current $1.1 million to a $10 million maximum. The ACCC's recommended it, and it's a good reform. In conclusion, I think this is a budget which doesn't tackle the central challenges of the age: equity, productivity, housing affordability and debt. A budget needs to do those things if it's going to pass the standards that Australians expect of governments of all persuasions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'd just like to acknowledge our other sponsors here this morning. Cantley, Canberra's most trusted recruitment partner, of course. Leigh is also a sponsor of the breakfast this morning, so welcome to them, as is Ord Minnett and Care Super. If we'd been standing here 10 years ago, we'd be talking about a Peter Costello budget surplus of somewhere north of $30 billion. We haven't had one since. So interestingly, we may never get back to that position, I would think, when you look at the figures that were released last night. It's nice to see Andrew refer to his friend and colleague, Michael. it's nice to have some political bipartisanship. I'm not sure how long that will last once they get out of the room. Questions, if you have any, please, you just need to stick your hand up. We're going to let our two special guests loose on our pollies first. We have Andrew Clennell from the Daily Telegraph with us. The Daily Telegraph not on strike, unlike his colleagues from Fairfax, who I think returned to work today. And we have Michael Packey from the Macquarie Radio Network. Who knows, with the changes that have been announced in media ownership, who might own the Macquarie Radio Network after the next couple of weeks. I know Andrew's very keen to get stuck into the Minister, so I'll let him go for it, and I'll find a space here somewhere and we'll give them a good old grilling for you. Andrew?
Thanks, Steve. Minister, well, I don't even know where to start. So Peter Credlin says it's a news poll budget. In some respects, it looks like a pre-election budget, but maybe it's about the re-election internally of Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison, I wonder. And look, the first part of my question is, how do you respond to that? But the second part is, it seemed to me with NDIS and Gonski, Labor mined the villages, and it seems to me you guys haven't cleared the mines. In fact, to some respect, you've put more mines in.
Well, look, thank you, Andrew, and I'll answer the second part of your question first, and that is that at long last we are actually fully funding NDIS. We are getting behind Gonski, and a needs-based model for schools is going to be equitable, it's fair, and there are 9,400 schools in Australia, and for almost all of those schools they're going to get an increase, and the funding is going to go where it should. It's going to be targeted, it's going to be funded, and I'm sure that parents, teachers, principals are going to be cheering across Australia since that announcement, but most of all the kids. They're going to get a better future because of that. As far as the comments from Peter Credlin and others, look, there's always going to be commentary around a budget, but I know what Scott Morrison delivered last night was a budget for all Australians. It's fair, it's costed, there's hope for the future, and certainly for small businesses, and that's my portfolio area, and I was delighted to see some of the measures in the budget for small business, particularly the extension to the instant asset write-off. And wherever I go, and I spend a lot of time on the road with James Pearson, I know he's here today, the CEO of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and on that roadshow, it was a listening tour. I heard how important the tax cuts were, I heard how important the instant asset write-off were, and I'm just so delighted that the Treasurer has seen fit and been able to find the savings in the, to find the money in the budget for that.
Sure,
it's great that you've managed to divert it back onto small business.
I'll always divert it back to small business.
About it.
What a budget for small business.
Your explanation about education, I don't think too many parents of Catholic school students are going to be cheering around the country.
Well, they're certainly cheering around my electorate. They're certainly cheering.
Are they?
Absolutely. Look, I've got more than 100
cheering
schools
about
in my
school
electorate.
fees going up.
Well, they're going to get more funding. They're going to actually get more money, and I appreciate. I understand the concerns of some of those schools. There's 51 of them which are not going to get the funding that they had previously. However, for the other 9,349, they're going to benefit. And when we talk about social justice, when we talk about equity, and that's what the school system teaches, then and I think it's fair, I think it's equitable, and I know it's fully funded.
But social justice, equity, fairness, are you a Conservative government or are you a Labor government? I mean, that's a question many commentators have asked after last night.
And we're a government which understands and acknowledges that education is the great enabler. As I said before, we understand that largely public schools, they used to be called state schools, they're largely the domain of state schools to fund. But we have supported the Catholic education system, the independent system, the private system for many, many years. We are continuing to do that, and certainly we're making sure the money's going.
I think a lot of people in this room had asked where the money's coming from, but Andrew, you criticise the government for not putting enough money into Gonski. You say there's $22 billion that they're cutting out of it. That money doesn't exist, so it's never, ever actually existed, has it?
Well, Steve, this is the future projections that we had, and if you look at the government's budget papers, they very clearly say that there is $22.3 billion less going into schools. We had a meeting of Catholic school parents here in the ACT earlier in the week, and there was outrage among those families at the cuts that are being inflicted on Canberra Catholic schools. We're talking about fairly low-fee schools, but schools that are going to have to increase their fees as a result. Just as students may well pay more to attend university, and university research funding is being cut back. I absolutely agree with Michael that education is the great enabler. I think he puts it very articulately. But then the challenge is to actually have the resources to back that up. The government could have those resources if they'd chosen not to provide a tax cut of $16,000 to millionaires or a huge company tax cut to the big end of town. It's about choices, and I don't think the government's got the choices right this time around.
Well, that $22 billion doesn't exist, does it? You keep using that figure, but it's not real.
It is the government's figure from the government's papers.
Michael?
Just a question for both of you. On the economic growth figures, do you think that they're too ambitious, given that you're expecting the budget to be back in surplus by 2021, $7.4 billion, which is a big increase on last year's budget, which I think there was expected about $1 billion to be back in surplus by that period. Do you think so? Do you think the growth figures are too ambitious, given that they're predicated very much on excessive wages growth?
Want to go first?
Yeah, well, you've got to, I think, look back at how previous forecasts have gone. Anytime someone tells you they can pick all the footy teams that are going to win this weekend, the right question is, how'd you go last weekend? In the first budget that Joe Hockey brought down, he said that in 2017-18, the fiscal year we're about to enter, the budget would be in balance. Now the government has a deficit of $29 billion for the fiscal year we're about to enter. So they haven't done particularly well in sticking to their projections.
But neither did Wayne Swan when he was Treasurer. He kept on saying that the budget would be back in surplus, and it never was.
Well, we did have a global financial crisis, and the tail of that was more significant than expected. But certainly I'm look at that 3% real growth number, and you look back over the last couple of decades, 3% real growth hasn't been sustained over that period, so I worry about that. The budget is forecasting higher unemployment than we have at the moment, and that's pretty concerning in an Australia where unemployment is higher than it should be, and underemployment is at record highs.
And Mr McCormack, well, as the Small Business Minister, the government was talking last night about there being wages growth. Well, there's a lot of the people that you would represent that may not be able to afford to pay their employees higher wages.
Well, by reinvesting in businesses, as small business owners and operators do, by getting that tax break, by getting that instant asset write-off, they will employ more Australians. That's a way, that's the road, that's the pathway to wages growth.
But doesn't this jar with the government's support for a cut to Sunday penalty rates?
Well, it's not the government's cut to penalty rates.
It's
the
Fair Work
Australian Fair
Australia,
Work
but the
Commission's
government
cut to penalty
supports
rates. The Australian Fair Work Commission, which was established by Labor, a review commissioned by Labor, and overseen by commissioners appointed by Labor. So it's not the government's penalty rates cut, and they're going to be commensurate with Saturday penalty rates. And Peter Strong from Cosboa said that will create 10,000 additional jobs. When you create more jobs, you create higher wages growth.
Andrew?
Well, Andrew, you had a neat line there, I thought, that the government has given up the fight on debt. But what's your plan for debt? More tax? What is Labor's plan on debt and deficit?
Well, we do a number of things, Andrew. One thing is that we wouldn't, and sorry, I'm just enjoying the Andrew Michael symmetry here, which has only just occurred to me. We would not go ahead with the government's plan for a big business tax cut. We don't believe that a tax cut, which on the government's own modelling delivers only 0.1% household income growth, is worthwhile. We believe that reining in those tax breaks to capital gains and negative gearing would not only improve housing affordability, but also help the budget bottom line. And we're pretty sceptical about the idea of taking off a temporary budget deficit levy at a time in which debt has increased so significantly by more than $4,000 a person just since Tony Abbott came to office. So there are a few of the measures, but we'll also be talking about more. Bill Shorten last week announced a multinational tax package which raises $5.4 billion over the course of the decade. We believe that money could be invested back in Australia's schools and universities and would bring a double dividend: fairness in the tax system, but equity in the schooling system.
Where do you
If I could
stand
just
on
step
the
in there,
NDIS?
our multinational tax avoidance legislation has already reaped $2.9 billion this year alone. $2.9 billion. And our profits diversion legislation currently before the Senate, that's an important measure too, to make sure that businesses doing activity in Australia pay their fair share of tax. So we're getting on with the job. We've already done it.
We're going to move on from debt in a moment, but how's the government going to seriously rein in that debt? I mean, I mentioned that 10 years ago we would have been standing here with a Peter Costello, John Howard surplus. Haven't had one since. And you look off into the horizon, it's a long way away.
Well, look, we'd love to be in surplus. There's no doubt
Well, how are you
about
gonna
that.
get
There would
there?
be people in this room who wouldn't have been alive when Labor last produced a surplus, which was back in 1989.
Yeah, but most people in this room also, with their household budgets, can't keep spending more than what they earn.
No, true, and that's why we're endeavouring to grow the economy. We're backing small business. We're building the infrastructure to create more jobs, to create more wealth. We've got in place 3 trade agreements, which we're endeavouring to make sure business benefits from that. So we're growing the economy and we're endeavouring as best we can to rein in expenses. The Treasurer said last night, back in surplus by 2021. It's a responsible budget. Bit by bit, little by little, we're going to get back into surplus.
I come here every year and every government of any persuasion says in the 4th year we'll have a surplus. And if you'll excuse my language, it's just all bullshit, isn't it? No one comes up with a surplus.
Well, Wayne Swan did announce in his 2019 budget that the four years of surplus, which I announced tonight, and the word you described was probably going through the minds of many accountants and many of the other politicians that were in the room at the time. But look, people know that the Liberal and Nationals are the economic managers or the good economic managers of the economy. Scott Morrison produced a very responsible budget last night and said that by 2021 we'll be back in surplus.
Well, I want to ask Andrew, sorry about that, Michael,
sure.
but the NDIS levy, this is very important. Where is Labor going to stand on this? He's sort of wedged you here, hasn't he?
Well, we'll work through and announce our position in the coming days. This is a tax increase which affects most Australians. It's a very significant measure. We worry that the Australian people are being asked to pay for the NDIS twice. In our budget papers, when we announced the NDIS, we made very clear how it would be funded, and part of that was an NDIS levy.
But it was never fully funded, was it?
It absolutely was, and you can look at the budget papers for that year. The decision
just
now...
in the forward estimates at the time.
I'm sorry?
Just in the forward estimates at the time, it was going to rise though, wasn't it, mate?
Well, in the forward estimates it was more than funded because the levy came on immediately and the NDIS costs came on later. What people worry about is the 10-year cost, and the 10-year that's why we set out those 10-year costings.
But isn't the big problem is no one's got any idea what NDIS is going to cost? No one. Because we don't even know yet who it's going to apply to. It hasn't been rolled out efficiently, and we're just going to have to keep stumping up big pots of money because no one can have an argument saying you can't fund help for the disabled.
Look, I worry about that sort of fatalism, Steve. When you certainly see it said in the commentariat from time to time, but when you actually look through the reports of the agency, you look at their caseload and you compare it with what was projected, all these stories about chaos and blowouts don't seem to square with the facts. It's worth just taking a bit of time to look at how it's being rolled out and the impact that it's having on people's lives. So those care packages are important, and the agencies are very conscious about the need to make sure that the care packages...
It's not fashionable, though, to say, as a nation, can we afford it? When you say that, people look at you and go, well, you can't say that because this money is going to the disabled. But doesn't someone have to say, can as a nation we afford something like this, Michael?
Well, look, I was the first New South Wales Member of Parliament to actually sign on to the Gonski measure, and I have to say that when Julia Gillard did announce it, that I thought that we should be looking after Australia's most vulnerable, and I think we're absolutely on a bipartisan ticket there. But the fact is, you've also got to fund these things. It's a little bit like Gonski, 27 different deals done. Western Australia, Queensland and the Northern Territory not even signed up to Gonski, and NDIS unfortunately fell into the same unfortunate unfunded boat. But we're going to fund Gonski.
We're talking
as well as NDIS.
NDIS.
We're funding both. We're making sure that the model that we're rolling out, we've done pilot programs, we've seen how it's
Yeah, but every time I raise this on Talkback Radio, I get calls from parents of disabled people saying it doesn't work.
Look, it will work. It has to work. It has to work because governments of any colour and stripe have to support Australia's most vulnerable, and we're getting on with the job of doing just that.
But on that issue, Andrew, on the NDIS and the Medicare levy, so what would Labor be looking at? Maybe would you support the levy cutting in at a different income threshold?
Well, Michael, we'll announce our position in the coming days. As
But
you know,
you were
Bill
quick
Shorten's,
to support the government's bank levy.
We have said that we'll support the bank levy, albeit that when a bank levy of 1/10 the size, with the revenue hypothecated to financial stability, was announced by Chris Bowen, he was accused of bringing about the end of Western civilisation. But putting that slight hypocrisy to one side, yes, we'll support it. But this is a Medicare levy that affects pretty much every working Australian. And we'll take our time, and you'll hear more from Labor. Of course, everyone's going to be watching Bill Shorten's budget reply, 7:30 Thursday night.
With great interest, Andrew. With great interest.
And that'll be naturally one of the issues that's canvassed.
Well, Michael, the Australian actually says this morning that the banks levy's a bit of a square up, that Scott Morrison didn't like the appointment of Anna Bligh as head of the Bankers Association instead of his former staffer, Sasha Grieve. And, you know, I just wonder how you respond to that, and also the broader question of why? Is it just to counter Labor's Royal Commission calls?
Well, Anna Bligh is a lobbyist for the banking industry, and she's doing a job. That's what lobbyists do. You would expect her to make those sorts of comments. Look, banks need to be more accountable. The Treasurer last night mentioned the Coleman Committee, and certainly David Coleman, the member for banks, ironically, or coincidentally, whatever you like to say, he's made sure that the banks have come in and answered serious questions, and last night's budget takes it that step further. An important step, making sure that banking executives are fully accountable, and if they're not, there's big penalties in place.
They're an easy big fat target though, aren't they?
Well, look, but Australians expect and demand and receive what they wanted last night in the order of making sure that banks are held accountable.
You're a national MP. Andrew's party would have a Royal Commission into the banks. Much of that Royal Commission would be about the way farmers have been treated by big banks. Do you not support stronger action against the banks?
Senator John Williams has made sure, and I know that when Senator John Williams rings banking executives, they shudder at the thought. But would a Royal Commission spend years and years and line lawyers' pockets and achieve little? Perhaps, possibly, probably. Would what Scott Morrison did last night in the budget make sure that banks are going to be held more accountable? Yes, absolutely.
No touch to negative gearing last night in the budget, Andrew. There was a suggestion that the coalition may fiddle at the edges, perhaps limit people to negatively gearing one property. What did you make of the fact that they did nothing on negative gearing?
Yeah, well, look, I should be scrupulously fair to the government. They made a tiny tweak to negative gearing, which means you can't deduct the travel expenses going to a property, to a rental property, to check it out. But substantively, we still have these extraordinary generous arrangements where, unlike Britain and the United States, you can cross the streams. You can deduct investment losses against wage income. Before we put in place the combination of the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing, net rental income in Australia was positive. Afterwards, it became negative, and basically now Australians buy a house not in order to make a recurrent gain, but so they can offset their interest losses against wage earnings and hope to make a capital gain in the future. That's not good investment advice. People should make investments in order to make year-on-year gains.
I suspect a lot of people in this room are doing exactly that.
Well, I wouldn't blame anyone who's abiding by the tax rules as they currently are. The job of parliamentarians is to make sure we have the right tax rules for the nation. And we know that these tax rules together have acted to increase house prices to the point at which home ownership is at a 60-year low, and which Sydney and Melbourne are ranked among the most unaffordable cities in the world, and where we saw at the end of last year house prices growing 10 times as fast as wages. So it's this disconnect between the sluggish wage growth we've talked about before and the extraordinarily rapid house price growth, which will mean that this Saturday in auctions across Australia, again, investors will be beating out first home buyers.
Just on
and
that,
it's just not the right way to do
you think it was smart of your colleague Senator Sam Dastyari to be going to northwest Sydney and laughing at what $1 million buys you in a house?
Look, Sam's got an edgy way of doing politics, but I think
Some might describe it as stupid.
Australians are much less concerned about Sam's four-letter words.
Yeah,
than
but going
about
out to
the
northwest Sydney and saying, look at what you get for $1 million, a house with security shutters, ha ha ha. That's pretty insulting. He's now been called a housing snob.
He's reflecting the frustration of his generation, a generation which have been locked out of the housing market like no previous generation.
Well, he's got
It's
an investment
just
property in
not
Camera.
fair.
He's doing okay.
But his generation have been locked out of the housing market. And as I said in my remarks before, the government last year thought it was appropriate to act. They took a package of negative gearing reforms to Cabinet and got rolled by Peter Dutton. Scott Morrison has talked about excesses in negative gearing. Jeff Kennett's called for changes to negative gearing. Joe Hockey called for changes to negative gearing. It's a financial stability issue as well, because the more that you encourage people to put all their eggs in the housing basket, the more risk there is that if there's a sudden change in interest rates, that has big knock-on effects in the economy, in a way you don't get if you've got an economy of owner-occupiers rather than investor housing.
Minister, you did make a change last night where young people trying to save for a deposit will be able to salary sacrifice into their superannuation up to a level of $30,000.
$30,000.
Now, have you had a look at what deposit you need on a house in Western Sydney or in Melbourne? I don't know that there's lots of accountants in the room here. They may be able to help me out, but I'm not sure you're going to get anywhere near a deposit on that sort of money.
Sure, but it's a good start, and you have to start somewhere, and it's a good incentive for young people in particular to get a start on their first home. And Andrew talked about Sydney and Melbourne. There's no housing affordability in regional areas. No housing affordability crisis in regional areas.
But are the jobs there?
And certainly there are jobs. Well, there are jobs there, and what we need is a more mobile workforce. There are jobs in regional Australia. Quite often, cafes put signs up, and other plants such as abattoirs and all manner of business enterprises in between are desperately seeking people to move to regional areas, regional capitals as well as small country towns, looking for people, and there's certainly affordable housing there.
Another issue in the budget was infrastructure and the government flagging this $75 billion which could be spent on various projects. One thing that I thought was interesting in the budget, why does the Commonwealth want to own the Snowy Hydro scheme outright and buy out New South Wales and Victoria?
Well, I think the Snowy Hydro is an iconic Australian facility, an amenity. And I, for one, have always wanted Snowy Hydro kept in Australians' hands. It's so important, it's so imperative, and you know, that's something that's die-in-the-ditch stuff for me. Snowy Hydro was built by migrants and Australians as well. It was a vision, and I know your party pushed that vision along. I acknowledge, I recognise that. Snowy Hydro is also there not just for power generation. I'm so pleased that the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was at Talbingo announcing Snowy Hydro 2.0 recently.
But on that issue, doesn't the government want to really own it because New South Wales and Victoria don't want to stump up any cash to expand 2.0?
Well, we want to make sure that there's energy security for Australians' future, not just to power Australian homes up and down the East Coast, but also power Australian businesses. We're growing the economy, so we want to make sure that happens. But we also want to make sure that there's water security for our irrigators. Now Labor, unfortunately, wanted to lock up all the water and let it go down straight out of the mouth of the Murray. we want to make sure that our farmers, and there are more farmers than unionists, I have to say, we want to make sure that our farmers have the ability and the amount of water, the right amount of water, whilst protecting the environment. Sure, that's important, but we want to make sure that we're able to take advantage of those Asian free trade agreements so that we can grow the food and fibre to make sure that we take advantage of those markets. And that's what the Snowy Hydro scheme also does. That's what it does. It's also an irrigation scheme, not just a power energy scheme.
If anyone has a question out there, just stick your hand up and we'll get to you as soon as we can. This budget certainly didn't have the feel of the first budget after an election. It was kind of not quite just pre-election, but close to. I was just going to ask both you gentlemen, when do you think the next election will be?
I think given the number of backflips and changed positions we've seen from this government, it would be very hard to predict Malcolm Turnbull's mind on anything. I suspect it will be whatever they think it is politically expedient to be, which is frankly a pity. Again, in the spirit of bipartisanship, the suggestion that we go to 4-year terms, which was raised by a member of the coalition recently, I think makes sense. That idea of going to a fixed 4-year cycle would mean we'd get a little bit more stability and predictability out of the economic management in Australia.
Michael?
Well, the next budget's not the next budget. That's due next year, 12 months from today. It's going to be a good one too, and I'm sure that we're going to be delivering it. But the next election is not due until 2019. State election for New South Wales is in March of that year, and I'm sure that all things being equal, that we'll probably follow them.
Let's take some talkback calls from the floor. Just direct your question to the Minister or the Shadow as appropriate.
Minister, my name's Ross Fox. I'm the Director of Catholic Education in Canberra-Goulburn.
Hello, Ross.
Quick to your feet,
I can't quite
well
hear
done.
the cheers from there.
We note that you weren't able to attend the public meeting we held on Monday night. We had about 550 teachers and parents expressing their frustration. One of the illustrations, there's a school in Canberra called St Francis Xavier Florey. It raises about $6,000 in private income per student. Not many people outside of Canberra may have heard of this school.
I have.
It's a great school.
I'm outside Canberra.
It's welcoming to refugees. It's really inclusive. I spoke with a principal yesterday. He says 10% of his students are on fee remission arrangements. Under this funding model, this school has the same fee expectations as Geelong Grammar, a school that's got a Year 9 campus, Timbertop, and raises in excess of $20,000 per student in private income. This is a needs-based funding model that's changed how need is defined in Catholic education, and the $18.6 billion investment is welcome in education, but not a single dollar in the next 10 years goes to a single Catholic school in the ACT.
Question.
How can this make sense for the needs of Catholic schools across Australia?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, look, thank you for your question, Ross, and certainly Catholic education as a whole is getting more money under this model than ever before. Record spending year on year. And as I understand, the funding model for the diocese across Australia is determined by the diocesan education system. And so the Catholics will receive record spending. It's up to the diocesan model as to where that funding is distributed. Look, I mentioned Catholic funding in my maiden speech. I mentioned it in my maiden speech. My children went to a Catholic school. I do believe in the Catholic education system. I believe in the public education system. My daughter is a high school teacher, has been a teacher in both the public system at Griffith High School for 3 years, and now she's in the independent system. And look, whatever the case might be, I know that the $18.6 billion that we're investing in education, record spending, is going to be needs-based. It's going to be targeted, and I think that that's the fair way to do it.
Okay, question up the back.
Thank you, Ross.
You might just have to shout it out. I'm not sure we can get a mic to you that easily.
Russell.
The retail industry represents 10% of the employment of all Australians. We know very well that overseas rates of pay in New Zealand around $13.50, UK $13.50 and USA $10 per hour. None of those countries currently pay penalty rates, yet we are a global organisation. We have to compete globally overseas. A little unknown thing that happened yesterday was that the low value threshold was delayed for another 12 months. My question is, firstly, to Andrew, when is the opposition going to support and understand that the Fair Work Commission was set up by Labor, it was done, and it's an independent body, and it should be allowed to make those decisions without government interference? And the second part of my point is, to the current government, why has that delay happened, and shouldn't that have been put straight through?
Okay, thank you,
We've
Russell.
been talking about that since 2008.
Good on you.
2009.
Andrew?
Well, thanks very much, Russell. We have weekend penalty rates for two reasons. One is to defend the weekend, a time in which most people are socialising, and the other is to bolster wages at the bottom of the distribution. At a time when community engagement is declining and inequality is rising, we took the admittedly unusual step of saying that we would seek to overturn a Fair Work decision that cut weekend penalty rates without providing the additional compensations that are usually provided in these circumstances. We know the kinds of people who work weekends earn, even with penalty rates, lower than average. And people at the bottom of the income distribution spend their entire paycheck. So when you take money out of people's paychecks, you also take money out of the retail sales that keep the economy going. In terms of the low value threshold, we've been supportive in principle of the government's changes. But finally, our reason for calling for a 12-month delay was that this seemed to have been absolutely botched. With outlets such as eBay and Amazon threatening to ban Australia, to lock Australia out of the system entirely if the government went ahead, and with Treasury themselves saying they're estimating 25% compliance. Can you imagine estimating 25% compliance in anything else and think it was workable? So reluctantly, given the government's failure to consult and their failure to put forward a workable model, we felt it was better to delay for a year. The government's report coming down yesterday made that same recommendation. I think we're yet to hear an announcement for the government as to whether they will actually delay, but Michael may correct me on that.
Minister?
No, I won't correct you on that. That's watch this space sort of thing. But certainly Labor looking to overturn the decision is like a tennis player overturning an umpire's quite correct. In one sense, the umpire's made the call on what he perhaps saw. He's the independent umpire, and here we have a player, let's call him John McEnroe, because he's kicked up a fuss and didn't like it, even though he appointed the umpire in the first place, overturning the call. Look, the Fair Work Commission was established by Labor. They've made the call. They've made the decision. As I said before, Peter Strong from the Council of Australian Small Business of Australia said that it will create 10,000 additional jobs. And so, you know, we have to abide by the umpire's decision in this instance.
Sorry, we've got a bunch of questions we need to get to. Okay. Down here.
Yeah, thank you. Minister?
Go ahead.
My name is Deep Saini. I'm the Vice Chancellor of the University of Canberra. I heard two messages in your speech earlier. One, that the budget is supportive of small and medium-sized businesses, and the second, it's nation-building budget. And I commend you for those two. But that begs a question regarding the university sector. Now, using government's own data and numbers, this sector is responsible for $22 billion worth of export income for Australia. It's the largest export service industry. It is not a single large multinational. It is made up of 40 small and medium-sized businesses spread across the country. And yet that sector of small and medium businesses has been singled out for a $2.8 billion cut, while you're saying that you're supporting the small and medium-sized businesses.
Question?
How does that square?
Well, the fact is a university degree, a tertiary degree, is still the very best loan that anyone will ever take out. And the fact is that we have lowered the threshold as to when you start paying back your tertiary degree to $42,000, but it's at an interest rate of 1%. And so that's the best loan you'll ever take out. And the taxpayer still subsidises any university degree by more than half. And so that is reasonable, that is fair, and your average tertiary degree still only costs just over $30,000. So, as I say, and that is the best loan you'll ever take out, and people with a tertiary degree inevitably end up with higher wages, with a better paid job than those who don't have that tertiary degree.
Andrew, you're going to go to war on uni changes?
Well, I'm certainly aware that for the ACT in particular, that the cuts to universities have a significant flow-on impact. Michael's talked about one aspect of the university cuts, but there's another aspect which is the $2.5 billion cut to university budgets at a time in which we're looking to serve more and more Australians and try and do more of that cutting-edge research. I'm just not sure how we become an innovative, agile, educated country when we're cutting back on the resources we're providing to universities. It's not just another sector, it's a sector which is laying the groundwork for future prosperity, for the Nobel Prizes, the inventions, for the research that provides breakthrough cures for diseases. All of that is being cut back with this new efficiency dividend that universities are being asked to deal with.
Okay, we do come back to the point someone's got to pay for it. Up the back.
Thank you. Bob Deutsch is my name, from the Tax Institute. I just wanted to ask the Minister a question about the big bank bash tax, if I may. There's not much detail in the budget papers about this tax, and I'm particularly concerned as to how the $6.2 billion estimate over the forward estimate period has been calculated.
Great question.
Whether it has regard to the fact that the amount of the tax is deductible to the bank, or whether it is available for the purposes of franking credits. If it's available for the purposes of franking credits, it actually might be a net positive for superannuation funds.
Sure, look, yeah, good question, and it's going to be on big banks' liabilities. But I'm a little bit like you. I listened very carefully to the Treasurer's speech last night. After that, I went from dinner to dinner, talking up small business, talking up the instant asset write-off. Got back to my office at 12:15. Read as much as I could on the budget. Got home at about 2 o'clock and was back here at 5. So. I've not actually drilled down into the detail of your question. I'm sure the Treasurer, Scott Morrison, will be having more to say about that in coming days and weeks, and I look forward to, like you, hearing exactly what he's got to say in that regard.
Take one more from up the back and then another couple from Andrew and Michael. Where are we? There we go.
Hi, Kate Wood from Women in Super. Firstly, I'd like to applaud the changes in terms of domestic violence. But my question relates to the impact of the budget on women. The economic circumstances of men and women in Australia is vastly different, and consequently budget measures can have a very different impact on men and women. But since the abolition of the women's budget, this is not immediately apparent to those responding on budget night. So I'm interested in some commentary on what the impact might be on women across the board of the budget, and also on the processes from here on until these measures are enacted in legislation in assessing those impacts. Thank you.
Well, let's give her a clap. Good question. I'm so pleased that exponentially more women are starting their own small businesses than are the other gender, than are men. Women, the number of women starting small businesses is growing at a higher rate than men, and now they're going to be able to take advantage of the 27.5% tax rate. Now they're going to be able to take advantage of that instant asset write-off, and I welcome that. We're really investing in women in small business. We're doing it through mentoring programs. We're doing it through incubation hubs, through startup successes, which are successes, and very much looking forward to seeing the sort of people who are doing just that, such as Fee Bendel and others. They're making great strides in making sure that women in business are first and foremost and front of centre when it comes to government policy. Thank you for your question.
Good on you, thank you.
Kate,
I am Go on, Andrew.
Just to go to a couple of budget measures on your very important question. I talked before about the inequality impacts of the tax cut to the top 1%, but of course that has gender implications too. The vast majority of recipients of that top-end tax cut will be men. At the same time, when you cut back on universities, you're disproportionately affecting women, who comprise most of Australia's students today. The cuts to schools are going to affect teachers, who, as we know, is a majority female occupation. And with Australians waiting up to 2 years before the Medicare freeze comes off, that will again disproportionately affect women who tend to be heavier users of medical services than men. So the gender lens is important, and I think in this case could be pretty revealing in a parliament in which the gender gap between the parties in the House has never been bigger. We're at 44%, they're at about 20%.
I'm mindful everyone wants to get away on time. We've got one more quick question there, and then we'll wrap things up.
Thank you. My name is Leanne Gundry. I'm involved in national business development at the Australian Institute of Management. I'd like to make the comment that I think the changes to small business, it's very important that there's a lot of women in business, and I think those changes support that. However, I don't feel that the previous question about the impact on the changes in the super system in terms of the gender impact have been fully addressed yet. I would like a comment from the government member, please. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I think the Treasurer will have more to say about that. I'd love to really sit here and answer your question more fully, but as I say, I think the Treasurer is going to have a lot more to say about the budget today. Certainly, he's got clear air. He and the Prime Minister are out there, and they're going to sell the message of the budget. I know it's fair. I know it's costed. I know it's responsible. It's the budget for all Australians. All Australians includes women. We know how important, Andrew's just mentioned how important women are in the super mix. We understand that, we acknowledge that, but I'm sure the Treasurer is going to have more to say about it today.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you all very much for coming. Let's hope we break our duck, and you might even be able to come back next year if you've still got a seat in the job, unlike some of our previous guests.
I need that lady down there to vote for me.
Can we
but the election's not until 2019, so...
Put our hands together for the Honourable Michael McCormack, Minister for Small Business. And I think we've all forgiven Andrew Leigh, given his excuse was that his children were out of control this morning.
That's fair enough.
And we also put our hands together for him turning up today. My colleague Michael Packey from Macquarie Radio, who is a Canberra resident. Thank you, Michael, very much. And Andrew Clennell, who famously got rid of Barry O'Farrell by revealing he got a free bottle of Grange Hermitage. Thank you, Andrew, for coming as well. And to our major sponsors, again, the Institute of Public Accountants. It's always wonderful to come and do this breakfast for you. The Canberra Business Chamber, you won't be able to get rid of me. I'm here 2 more times this month. And also to Cairns. So thank you. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you for coming along.